Hello everybody, Sean Samhain. I haven't been around much on the vlog front lately or anything else because I'm here in Malta doing a small tour and also getting footage for a film. And I want to talk about the the meaning of Samhain in terms of what our ancestors meant about the thinning of the veil. Now, it's a very interesting idea, but first I want to talk about something leading to this. Ultimately, it was about ancestor veneration. By veneration, that means ancestral dignity, the ability to give dignity to our ancestors, to not judge them by our standards. So, for example, I'd be completely wrong of me to judge the, the lifestyle and the behaviour of my great grandparents because they grew up in they grew up in Dublin at the time of the War of Independence. There would have been battles and bullets flying everywhere, tremendous poverty, and they would have done things like slaughtered chickens, and they would have walked down the streets in central Dublin and saw cows and pigs having their throats cut, and then went in to buy the meat. And because I don't have to deal with that, it's very easy for me to sit there and say, "Oh well, they were not like me; they weren't different." No, we're all agents of the circumstances of our time that we live in, and I can assure you that people in the future will look at how I and you and everyone else lives and our descendants, and they will say that how could they live like that? And I think that's the most important thing of all, is to not so much celebrate the ancestors in terms of they existed, but celebrate the fact that they were dignified, regardless of the mores, coups, and protocols of the particular era they lived in. One of the things that struck me in Malta is, and the last time I was here, and I'm not putting down Malta, it's a wonderful country, but in terms of the archaeology, the archaeologies here, Malta is an extremely Catholic country, extremely Catholic. It's old fashioned, old world Catholic. If you go to look at the murals and the artwork and some of the strangeness inside, say, St. John's Cathedral in Valletta, which I'll be presenting videos on later. If you have to take off your cap if you're wearing one. Women who have bare shoulders and low cut tops have to wear a shawl given to them to remain modest, and that's a level of Catholicism I haven't seen in Ireland since I was a little kid. It still exists here mainly because of the power of the Knights of St. John and the legacy. Now I understand where that comes from too. They had to fight off the Ottomans in some horrific battles in the past to maintain that, but yet Malta's very, very, very Catholic. And that old time Catholic, the real old time, old time Sicilian type Catholic, or the old time Irish that you would have had that you don't have now Catholic. Now, this extends into, of course, archaeology and antiquities. And you go to the ancient sites and you see the statues at these megalithic sites of the giant people who were the original inhabitants of Malta. And they're beautiful portrayals of women 5,500 years ago, and they have their hair braided, and they're wearing dresses with pleated skirts. Very high quality and high level of fashion, clearly, obviously, they had, and sophistication in terms of the artistic aesthetic of how they lived at the time. Some of the intricate stone carvings are just, they're beyond imaginable, and that you cannot believe you're looking at something that's so old. Not just spirals, but perfectly rendered spiral motifs that have serifs like leaves on everything on them. And we're talking about 5,500 years ago. And this is a problem to the antiquities of Malta, which is essentially Jesuitic. If you look at all the people who took part in the excavations, overseeing findings, theories, etc., of the Maltese archaeology, they're always connected. They're always Jesuits. So many of them are priests and stuff like that, and they have a vested interest in portraying the ancestors ill-dignified manner. For example, I just told you about the statues of the women, and they practically venerated women. Now we don't know for sure, and this is a theory I'm working on regarding Malta. If these statues of the giant women were made by the giants that originally lived in Malta, or they were made by the first humans who came here, and they actually had in the Neolithic times, and they had from Sicily, and they had an affection for these Maltese giants, and they portrayed, especially particularly the mothers, the females, and the statues are all of females, and I said with braided hair, pleated skirts, and obviously sophisticated clothing. But when you go to the Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, they show you how, well, how their version of how the stones were moved. And what they show you is basically monkeys, Planet of the Apes, fellas with animal skins on them, moving the stones with basic logs, and they're dressed. They have no clothes, and yet the statues are dressed in a high level of fashion. And there's your your degrading and mocking of the ancestors right there, and it's right there, and that's what the legacy of the ancient people is, not just in Malta. I've seen it, you see it in museums in Ireland, you see it in museums everywhere. They're savages. They don't have clothes, they don't have sophistication, and it's only by sheer chance they built these remarkable technologically advanced structures, because they weren't part of the biblical timeline, and that's why the Jesuits get involved in all that stuff. Now, this brings us to the idea of Samhain and ancestor veneration. The thinning of the veil is not is polluted by the Halloween idea that when a human dies, they go to heaven. It's a one-way trip and they never come back. But pagan people and indigenous people all over the world, and polytheistic people who believe in reincarnation, or the concept that the ancestors are not dead, and this is where the Halloween Samhain thing got confused. When they talk about the thinning of the veil, you have these rituals all over the world where people look upon their ancestors as just being in a different reality. They're not gone to heaven where there's a one-way trip and there's no way to contact them, like the Christians say. They're not vanished forever and gone. They're somewhere else. And at certain parts of the year, and if you look at the Samhain thing, it's absolutely universal. The idea of a day of the dead, a week of the dead, a month of the dead, and so on, that the veil has been thinned and spirits walk the night. Now the Christians transformed the spirits into demons or devils, but the ancient ancestors would have seen that as a time where your great uncle Michael, well, I wouldn't call him Michael, but your great uncle or your great auntie or your brother who passed away in an accident, or your sister who died in a war, they were accessible that night. You had, normally you would have had like just a telephone line, and suddenly on Samhain and festivals like that, you have like high-speed broadband and you can contact them directly and clearly. And that was what that was about. The thinning of the veil meant that the loved ones who were no longer in this reality were suddenly accessible, because their reality and our reality came close together. And this has to do with lunar and solar cycles and so on. And that's why they picked these dates. They never saw the ancestors dead and gone and forgotten, where the Christians do and the Abrahamics do. The ancestors dead, they're gone. What they do, how they feel, it doesn't matter. They're out of here. They've no part to play in our existence, because they're gone to heaven. They're gone to the clouds, or to the Hebrew space fairy. But our ancient ancestors didn't see it that way. The body was gone. It was it was not with life, whatever life is. But that didn't mean the life was extinguished and had dissipated into nothing. It had simply transformed into another existence. And this is where we get this whole thing. Within antiquities, if you look at Egypt, it's because of the Islamic professors and so on. If you look at the Middle East, it's because of the Jewish ones. If you look at the Europeans, it's because of the Christians, the Jesuit ones, or the Presbyterian ones. The whole thing is the ancestors were backward stupid. They weren't like us. They didn't have the sophistication, intelligence, and the the subtleties of sophistication that we have, and that's absolute nonsense. They were not grunting drug troglodytes, as these academics say. And you cannot go to places like the Temple of Tajin here in Malta and say to yourself, these people were backward. These people were incredibly advanced. And they had abilities that do not get the respect. You'll have people say how did they do it? You know, it's patronizing. You'll have like that awful National Geographic special on Easter Island, where they showed them how they prove how they moved the Easter Island statues, and what they did was they showed them rocking. It was like a thing covered in concrete, basically a piece of styrofoam, rocked back and forth on a road with ropes, and what they didn't tell the viewers was that those statues extend all the way down to their feet and they stand upon plinths. So that theory was nonsense, and yet that was scientific gaslighting. But why was it scientific gaslighting? Because again, they had to prove the ancients were not us. They were different. They were almost like a dream that never happened, because they can't explain how ancient people built these things, and it all is rooted in the timeline of the Bible. Now, always remember that. So when you're celebrating Samhain, you think of the ancestors being closer. And the best way to identify this near proximity of your ancestors is to acknowledge how amazing they were and to not judge them according to your standards now, be they philosophical, theocratic, political, or social. They had to exist in the world that they existed within, through no fault of their own, by the means that they could. And that is how you honour the ancestors at Samhain.